She walked in as a customer, but they treated her like she didn't belong. What happens when a bank questions the wrong woman without knowing she owns the company? Stay tuned because this changes everything. The CEO no one expected. A visit that changed everything. Jessica Carter had built Summit Trust Bank from the ground up. She had spent years ensuring it became a financial institution that valued fairness, transparency, and respect for all customers. But today, she wasn't here as the CEO. She wasn't stepping into the bank for an investor meeting, a boardroom discussion, or a press conference. Today, she was just another customer. It was late afternoon when she arrived at one of her own branches, a location she had personally overseen from the very beginning. The warm glow of the setting sun filtered through the glass doors, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Dressed casually in jeans, a simple cardigan, and sneakers, Jessica didn't carry the aura of a corporate executive. She had no briefcase, no assistant trailing behind her, and no intention of drawing attention to herself. This was a test to see if the values she had built into this bank, fairness, professionalism, and respect for every customer, regardless of appearance or status, were truly being upheld. But what she didn't expect was how quickly this simple visit would turn into something much bigger. A quiet entrance and an immediate shift in atmosphere. As Jessica walked through the automatic doors, a slight chill in the air greeted her. The bank was moderately busy. Customers speaking in hushed tones with tellers, employees shuffling between desks, the occasional ring of a phone breaking the steady hum of activity. No one seemed to recognize her. That was fine. She didn't want them to. She approached the counter with a calm, neutral demeanor, just another person making an everyday transaction, a simple withdrawal. The teller, Emily Rogers, was seated behind the counter, typing on her computer. She didn't immediately acknowledge Jessica's presence. Instead, she offered a quick, dismissive glance before turning back to her screen. Jessica stood there for a moment, waiting for the standard greeting. It never came. Clearing her throat, she spoke evenly. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal." Emily barely looked up. Without a smile, without a, "How can I assist you?" without even the most basic level of customer service, she simply slid a clipboard across the counter. "Fill this out." Jessica arched an eyebrow but didn't argue. She glanced down at the form. Name, account number, withdrawal amount. Simple enough. She quickly filled in the details, writing down $5,000, a reasonable sum, enough to require ID verification, but not so large that it should raise suspicion. Sliding the completed form back, Jessica handed over her government-issued ID, expecting the standard process to begin. Instead, everything changed. The first signs of trouble. Emily picked up Jessica's ID, eyes flicking between the name on the card and the screen in front of her. Her posture stiffened. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. A noticeable pause filled the space between them. Something had shifted. Jessica knew this pause. She had seen it too many times before. Emily looked up, but not at Jessica. Instead, she glanced toward the back office, where the branch manager's office was located. Then, in a voice that now carried a trace of uncertainty, she said, "Could you hold on a second?" Without waiting for a response, she grabbed Jessica's ID and disappeared behind the frosted glass door. Jessica watched her go, her fingers lightly tapping against the marble counter. She had expected to be treated fairly. She had expected this withdrawal to take only a few minutes. But now she had a feeling this was going to be a test, just not the one she had planned. The waiting game minutes passed. Jessica remained calm, standing at the counter as a few customers cast curious glances in her direction. She wasn't causing a scene. She wasn't making demands. She was waiting to see just how far this would go. Because if there was one thing she knew about people in positions of unchecked authority, It was that they always revealed who they truly were when they thought no one was watching. Jessica Carter was watching, and she was about to find out exactly what kind of bank she had built. What happened next? It would change everything. Jessica Carter stood at the counter, waiting. She had expected a simple, no-hassle withdrawal, something that should have taken only a few minutes. But now, it was turning into something else entirely. She had handed over her ID and completed withdrawal slip. Everything was in order. There was no reason for a delay, and yet the teller, Emily Rogers, had disappeared into the back with her ID. Jessica wasn't naive. She had seen this hesitation before. She had experienced this type of scrutiny before, but never at her own bank. The manager arrives, but not to help. A few minutes later, the frosted glass door behind the counter swung open, and Daniel Whitman, the branch manager, stepped out. Emily followed closely behind, her eyes darting toward Jessica before quickly looking away. Daniel was a middle-aged man in a neatly pressed suit and polished dress shoes, carrying himself with the authority of someone who thought he was in charge of the room. Jessica noticed how his expression shifted slightly when he laid eyes on her. Not a look of recognition, not a look of respect, but calculated skepticism. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter," he greeted her with a stiff, overly formal smile. Jessica tilted her head slightly. "He knows my name now? Interesting." "Good afternoon," she responded, keeping her tone neutral. Daniel glanced down at the form in his hand, the same form Jessica had filled out 10 minutes ago, as if he was seeing it for the first time. "I understand you're making a withdrawal today?" Jessica raised an eyebrow. "That's right, $5,000. Daniel hummed as if considering something, then held up her ID to the light, tilting it from side to side. Jessica exhaled slowly. She had opened this bank. She had personally approved the security protocols, and now she was being treated like someone trying to pull off a fraudulent transaction. "Is there a problem, Mr. Whitman?" she asked, her patience starting to wear thin. "Not at all," Daniel said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He set the ID down on the counter but didn't return it to her. Instead, he looked back up at her with a question she hadn't expected. "What do you do for work, Ms. Carter?" Jessica blinked. Of all the things he could have asked, this was what he wanted to know. She kept her expression even. "I run a bank." Daniel gave a slow nod, exchanging a glance with Emily. Neither of them reacted like they believed her. Jessica could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't about security. This was about assumptions. The interrogation disguised as policy. Daniel tapped his fingers against the counter, still avoiding giving her ID back. "Is this a personal account or a business account?" Jessica's jaw tightened. "It's on the form." He nodded but didn't check. Instead, he asked, "And just to clarify, is this your first time banking with us?" Jessica let out a short, humorless laugh. First time? She had signed the lease for this building. She had approved the hiring of every manager in this district. She had cut the ribbon at this branch's grand opening, and now she was being treated like she didn't belong here. She straightened her shoulders, her voice calm but firm. "I have banked here since the day this branch opened." A brief, uncomfortable silence followed. Daniel tapped the form with his index finger. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? Jessica narrowed her eyes. He was stalling. She could feel it now. The deliberate slowdown, the unnecessary questions, the passive attempt to make her justify her own money. She had seen this playbook before. Delay, question, doubt. Make the customer feel like they don't belong. Jessica had built this institution to be different, and yet here she was, standing in the very bank she founded, facing the same discrimination she had worked so hard to eliminate. The final straw. Jessica inhaled slowly, choosing her next words carefully. "You have my ID, my account number, and my transaction request. What exactly is the issue here, Mr. Whitman? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached under the counter and pulled out a small clipboard. We just need you to fill out a few additional verification questions before we can proceed. Jessica stared at the clipboard. She had seen this form before. It was not standard procedure, and she knew for a fact that none of the other customers currently withdrawing money had been asked to do this. She glanced around at the older man at the next teller, casually withdrawing what looked like at least 10 grand. At the woman in business attire, being handed an envelope without hesitation. None of them were being questioned, just her. Jessica's fingers curled into a loose fist against the counter. Her voice dropped just slightly, low, deliberate, powerful. Tell me something, Daniel. His name caught him off guard. He swallowed. Yes? Jessica leaned in just slightly, not aggressive, not threatening, but undeniable. Are you asking me these questions because it's policy? A pause, a flicker of hesitation in his expression. Jessica tilted her head. Or are you asking because you don't think I belong here? The bank was silent. Everyone was listening now. Daniel shifted his weight. He suddenly looked uncomfortable. Good, let him feel it. She had been patient. She had been respectful. And still, she was being treated like she was out of place in a bank she built with her own two hands. She wasn't going to let this slide. The moment of realization. Daniel opened his mouth, but Jessica didn't let him speak. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. And in one simple motion, she hit record. Daniel paled. Jessica's voice was clear, unwavering. I'd like to document why I'm being asked for additional verification, despite having provided my ID, my account number, and my withdrawal slip. Emily took a small step back. Daniel froze. Jessica didn't move. She had given them a chance. They had made their choice. And now, she was about to make hers. Jessica Carter stood at the counter, her patience hanging by a thread. She had come into Summit Trust Bank, the institution she built from the ground up, expecting a simple transaction, a $5,000 withdrawal. But instead of efficiency, professionalism, or even basic customer service, she was met with scrutiny, unnecessary delays, and a quiet but unmistakable resistance. This wasn't about policy. This wasn't about security. This was about assumptions, and Jessica could see them clearly. The subtle shift in treatment. From the moment Jessica had handed over her ID and withdrawal slip, the atmosphere had changed. At first, Emily Rogers, the teller, had barely acknowledged her. There was no greeting, no professional courtesy, just a clipboard shoved in her direction with a curt, "Fill this out." But the real shift came when Emily saw the amount. $5,000. Her posture changed. Her tone became more hesitant. Her fingers lingered over the keyboard. She didn't process the request immediately. Instead, she excused herself, took Jessica's ID, and disappeared into the back office. Jessica wasn't a fool. She had seen this too many times before. But what struck her most wasn't the inconvenience. It was the assumption behind it. The silent message. As Jessica stood waiting, she took in the room around her. Other customers were moving in and out, some withdrawing cash, some making deposits. One man, well-dressed in a tailored suit, casually withdrew what looked like at least $10,000. No questions, no second glances. A woman in business attire received a thick envelope of cash without hesitation. But Jessica, she had been asked to wait. She had been questioned. And now she was being subjected to a verification process that she knew for a fact wasn't standard practice. The silent message was clear. She didn't fit their idea of someone who should be withdrawing that amount of money. The power of assumptions. Jessica had spent years building Summit Trust Bank to be different. An institution where customers were treated with fairness, where access to financial services wasn't dictated by race, gender, or background. And yet here she was, a black woman, dressed in casual clothes, trying to withdraw money from her own account. And suddenly she was met with doubt. Who was she? Why did she need this money? Did she really have access to this account? It wasn't explicit. No one outright said they didn't trust her. But it was there, in the hesitation, in the extra steps, in the way the manager, Daniel Whitman, looked at her ID as though it couldn't possibly belong to her. Bias doesn't always come in loud, obvious actions. Most of the time, it comes in small, quiet barriers. A slightly longer wait time, an extra layer of security applied selectively, a certain tone of voice reserved for people who don't fit the expected profile. And Jessica wasn't blind to it. The questions that weren't about security. When Daniel Whitman finally emerged from the back, ID still in hand, he carried himself with the kind of authority that suggested he thought he was in control of the situation. But he wasn't. "Good afternoon, Ms. Carter," he said, offering a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I understand you're making a withdrawal?" Jessica matched his gaze. "That's right. $5,000. Daniel nodded slowly, glancing at her ID again. Then the questions began. "What do you do for work, Ms. Carter?" Jessica felt a flicker of irritation. What did that have to do with her withdrawal? Still, she kept her voice steady. "I run a bank." Daniel's smile didn't waver, but she saw it, the briefest flash of disbelief. He didn't believe her. He exchanged a quick glance with Emily before continuing. "And this is a personal account, correct?" Jessica's fingers tapped against the counter. "It's right there on the form." Daniel didn't check. Instead, his next question made it painfully obvious what was really happening. "And just to clarify, is this your first time banking with us?" Jessica almost laughed. This branch? The one she had approved? The one where she had signed the lease? The one where she had cut the damn ribbon at the grand opening? "I've banked here since the day this branch opened." A long pause. A glance exchanged between Daniel and Emily. And then, as if the entire conversation hadn't just happened, Daniel said, "I'll need you to answer a few more verification questions before we can proceed." Jessica had had enough. The moment everything changed. She exhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm but sharp. "Tell me something, Mr. Whitman." Daniel hesitated. "Yes?" Jessica tilted her head. "Are you asking me these questions because it's policy?" His face remained neutral, but she saw the flicker of uncertainty. She took a small step closer, lowering her voice just slightly. "Or are you asking because I don't look like the kind of person who should be withdrawing this amount?" The bank went silent. A few nearby customers glanced over. Emily stiffened behind the counter. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. He knew. He knew exactly what was happening. And now so did everyone else. Jessica let the silence stretch, letting him sit with the weight of his choices. And then, with one simple motion, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. With a tap of her screen, she started recording. The consequences of bias. Daniel paled slightly. "Ms. Carter, I assure you..." Jessica cut him off. "I'd like it on record why I'm being asked these additional questions, despite already providing my ID, my account number, and my transaction slip." She turned her camera slightly, capturing Emily at the counter. "And I'd like to know why customers behind me are withdrawing larger amounts without being questioned." Emily swallowed hard. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He had no answer. Jessica let the silence sit. She wasn't angry. She wasn't raising her voice. She was simply holding them accountable. And in that moment, the power shifted, because the truth was out, and now they had to answer for it. Jessica Carter stood firm. She had come into Summit Trust Bank, the institution she had built with her own hands, expecting a routine withdrawal, a simple request for $5,000 from her personal account. But instead, she had been subjected to unnecessary scrutiny, invasive questions, and silent but unmistakable bias. Now she had reached her breaking point. The atmosphere inside the bank had shifted. Tension filled the air. Customers who had initially paid no attention were now watching. Employees who had gone about their business now stood still, waiting to see what would happen next. Jessica had given them every opportunity to do the right thing. But instead of respecting her as a valued customer, as the very owner of this institution, they chose to test her. And now, she was done playing their game. The power shift begins. Jessica's voice was calm but sharp as she fixed her gaze on Daniel Whitman, the branch manager. You have my ID, you have my account number, you have my withdrawal request. So tell me, Mr. Whitman, what exactly is the holdup? Daniel hesitated. The confident, condescending demeanor he had carried just moments ago was starting to crack. Ms. Carter, we take security very seriously, he said, his tone measured but unsteady. This is just a precaution. Jessica tilted her head slightly. A precaution? She repeated, letting the word linger. Tell me, what part of your precaution is different from the customers behind me who have walked away with even more money, without a single question asked? A flicker of discomfort crossed Daniel's face. She had him cornered, and he knew it. A crowd gathers. By now, a few customers had stopped their transactions to listen. A man in a navy blazer, standing just a few feet away, looked back and forth between Jessica and the manager, brows furrowed. Another woman, still holding an envelope of cash she had just withdrawn, muttered, "She's right." I didn't have to answer a single question. Jessica let out a slow breath. They were paying attention now. Good. No more excuses. Jessica lowered her voice, not in defeat, but in controlled authority, a tone that demanded honesty. Let's be clear, Mr. Whitman. You didn't question me because of bank policy. Daniel opened his mouth, but she wasn't finished. You questioned me because you saw a black woman in casual clothes withdrawing money, and you assumed I wasn't someone who belonged here. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Emily, the teller, shifted uncomfortably in her seat, eyes darting between Jessica and her manager. Daniel's face paled. The breaking point. Daniel cleared his throat, trying to recover control of the situation. Ms. Carter, I can assure you— No, Jessica cut in. You can't assure me of anything. Her voice remained even, but every word hit like a hammer. She took a small step forward, closing the space between them, forcing him to feel the weight of what he had done. Because if you could, you wouldn't be standing here, scrambling for an excuse while holding my ID hostage. Daniel swallowed hard. Jessica didn't blink. She had been through too much in her career, too much in her life to be intimidated by a man who had let his own bias dictate his decision-making. She had built this bank to be different, and yet here she was, being treated like an outsider in her own creation. Jessica takes action. Without breaking eye contact, Jessica reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She held it up, screen facing the manager. A single tap. She was recording. Daniel visibly tensed. I want to document what's happening here, Jessica said, her voice crystal clear. I want it on record that after providing my identification and following all necessary procedures, I'm still being denied access to my own money. A hush fell over the bank. Emily, the teller, looked like she wanted to disappear. A security guard near the entrance shifted on his feet, unsure of whether to step in. Daniel, however, had no way out. His eyes darted to the camera. His carefully rehearsed, polite professionalism was gone. He had underestimated Jessica, and now he was trapped. The moment of reckoning. Jessica let the silence drag on before delivering the final blow. Mr. Whitman, I'd like to introduce myself properly. Daniel blinked, confused. Jessica took a deep breath and dropped the bombshell. I'm the founder and CEO of Summit Trust Bank. A visible shock ran through the room. Someone gasped. Emily's mouth fell open. The customers in line exchanged stunned glances. Jessica turned slightly, addressing the entire room now. This branch exists because of me. I signed the lease for this building. I approved the hiring of the staff here, including Mr. Whitman. And today I walked in as a customer, only to be treated like I don't belong. Daniel looked like he was about to be sick. Jessica let the truth sink in. So tell me, Mr. Whitman, she said, voice steady, unshaken. Would you like to continue verifying if I have the right to be here? Daniel couldn't even look her in the eye anymore. His hands trembled slightly as he silently slid her ID back across the counter. I'll process your withdrawal now, Ms. Carter, he murmured, voice barely audible. Jessica picked up her ID, never breaking her stare. Yes, you will. The aftermath. As Daniel hurriedly typed into the system, the air in the bank remained thick with tension. Jessica could feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about her. It was about every customer who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. It was about every person who had been subtly questioned, doubted, and disrespected because of someone else's assumptions. And she wasn't going to let it slide. When the transaction was complete, she took the envelope of cash, slipping it into her bag. Then, before turning to leave, she spoke one last time. I'll be in touch with corporate about this. Daniel visibly winced. Jessica turned and walked toward the exit, but she knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jessica Carter had been patient. She had given the bank every opportunity to correct their mistake, to process a simple $5,000 withdrawal without unnecessary obstacles. But they had made their choice. Now it was her turn. The tension in the room. The silence inside Summit Trust Bank was deafening. Every customer, every employee, even the security guard near the entrance. All eyes were on Jessica. She had walked in as just another customer. Now she was the center of attention. And the people who had doubted her? They were scrambling. Daniel Whitman, the branch manager, looked like he had just swallowed glass. His confidence, the arrogance he had carried when he questioned her, when he held her ID hostage, when he made her feel like she had to justify her own money, it was gone. In its place, panic. Jessica let the weight of the moment sink in before she spoke. I want to introduce myself properly. Daniel blinked. He looked confused, unsure if he had just misheard her. Jessica took a slow step forward, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. I'm the founder and CEO of Summit Trust Bank. The moment of realization. The reaction was immediate. A customer in line let out an audible gasp. Emily, the teller who had first questioned her, went completely still. Even the security guard at the entrance straightened up, suddenly unsure of what to do. But no one looked more stunned than Daniel. His face went pale. His lips parted slightly as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came out. Jessica had seen this reaction before. The moment when someone realizes they've made the worst mistake of their career. She let the silence stretch. Let Daniel sit in his own discomfort. Then she spoke again, this time addressing the entire room. The truth is exposed. This branch exists because of me. Her words cut through the air like a blade. I signed the lease for this building. I approved the hiring of the staff, including Mr. Whitman here. I've banked here since day one. And today I walked in as a customer, only to be treated like I don't belong. Another ripple of whispers moved through the room. Jessica didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The truth was loud enough. She turned back to Daniel, who was now visibly sweating. So tell me, Mr. Whitman, she continued, her tone even, deliberate. Would you like to continue verifying whether I have the right to be here? A desperate attempt to regain control. Daniel finally found his voice, but it was weak, shaky. Ms. Carter, I can assure you this was just a misunderstanding. Jessica raised an eyebrow. A misunderstanding? Daniel nodded quickly, desperate to salvage what little dignity he had left. Yes, of course. Just a routine security check, nothing more. Jessica tilted her head slightly, studying him. Then she did something Daniel wasn't expecting. She smiled, not a warm, forgiving smile, a knowing smile, a smile that told everyone in the room that she wasn't buying a single word. The final blow, Jessica reached down, picked up her ID from the counter, and held it up. You mean to tell me that after seeing my name, my account number, and my transaction request, it still took me revealing my title for you to suddenly process my withdrawal? Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. Jessica let the silence hang. Then she turned slightly, angling her phone toward him. And just to confirm, you're now admitting that I do, in fact, have the right to withdraw my own money? Daniel nodded quickly. Yes, of course, Ms. Carter. Jessica nodded, pressing a button on her phone. Great, because I've recorded this entire conversation. The damage is done. Daniel's eyes widened in horror. Wait, you recorded... Jessica cut him off. Every second of it. From the moment I walked in to the moment you decided I needed extra verification for a routine withdrawal, to the moment you realized who I was and suddenly changed your tune. The color drained from his face. Jessica simply slipped her phone back into her bag. I'll be sharing this with corporate, and if necessary, the media. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it, because there was nothing left to say. The aftermath: within seconds, Jessica's withdrawal was processed. Emily, the teller, couldn't even look her in the eye as she counted out the bills and placed them in an envelope. Jessica took it without another word. Then, before leaving, she looked at Daniel one last time. I built this bank to serve everyone, not just the people who fit your expectations. She turned, walking toward the exit. The customers in the room parted for her as she passed. And as she stepped outside, she took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. Because this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. And she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Not now. Not ever. Jessica Carter had walked into Summit Trust Bank as a customer. She walked out as a force of reckoning. The moment she stepped outside, she knew this wasn't over. What had happened inside that bank, the blatant disrespect, the silent biases, the unnecessary scrutiny, wasn't just a personal insult. It was a systemic failure. And Jessica Carter, she didn't let things slide. The fallout begins. By the time Jessica arrived home that evening, the video she had recorded in the bank was already uploaded to a secure drive. She watched it again, taking in every detail. The dismissiveness from Emily, the teller. The arrogance and condescension from Daniel, the branch manager. The moment when the atmosphere shifted only after she revealed her identity. And the most damning part? The silence. The way Daniel stumbled over his words when she called him out. The way the employees avoided eye contact when they realized the truth. The way the entire bank froze, knowing they had made an irreversible mistake. Jessica didn't need to raise her voice. The truth had spoken for itself. And now, she was about to make sure the consequences were just as loud. An emergency meeting with corporate. The next morning, before the bank even opened for business, Jessica was already on a call with the corporate executives of Summit Trust Bank. It wasn't a request for a meeting, it was a demand. And when the CEO of the entire company gets involved personally, people listen. At precisely 8 a.m., Jessica stepped into the company's headquarters. The air inside the boardroom was thick with tension. Seated around the massive conference table were 6 top executives, including the regional director and chief operating officer. They all knew why they were here. Jessica sat at the head of the table, placing her phone on the table in front of her. Before we begin, she said, voice steady, I'd like to play something for you. And with a single tap, the recording played. The entire room fell silent. They heard everything. The questions, the hesitation, the blatant shift in tone after her identity was revealed. By the time the recording ended, not a single executive met Jessica's gaze. Finally, the COO cleared his throat. "Ms. Carter," he started, "this is unacceptable." Jessica leaned back, arms crossed. "You're right, and now I want to know what you're going to do about it." The immediate actions taken. The response was swift. Within hours, corporate had sent an official team to the branch for a full investigation. By noon, Jessica received a personal email from HR confirming checkmark Daniel Whitman, the branch manager, was officially terminated. Emily Rogers, the teller, was placed under review for misconduct. The entire branch was scheduled for emergency bias training, but that wasn't enough. Jessica pushed for more, and she got it. By the end of the day, Summit Trust Bank's corporate leadership announced mandatory bias training for all employees in every branch nationwide, a new policy ensuring that all withdrawals, regardless of customer appearance or assumptions, follow the same verification process, an anonymous reporting system for customers and employees to report unfair treatment. The message was clear. What happened to Jessica Carter was never going to happen again. The ripple effect. The consequences didn't stop there. As news of Daniel's termination and corporate's immediate response spread internally, employees across the company began speaking up. Reports started flooding in. Other employees admitted they had witnessed similar treatment of certain customers, but were too afraid to challenge it. Some customers came forward with their own stories, sharing how they had faced subtle discrimination at different branches. Branch managers across the country were now under pressure to enforce actual fair banking practices. Jessica had forced a reckoning, and now the entire banking system was shifting. The public reaction. Jessica hadn't posted the video publicly. She hadn't needed to. Word spread like wildfire. Customers began sharing their own experiences with banking bias. Some even closed their accounts in protest, demanding change. Summit Trust Bank had no choice. They issued a public apology, acknowledging the incident and outlining the steps they were taking to ensure fairness moving forward. And while some people were skeptical, others felt hope. Hope that this was more than just a PR stunt. Hope that real change was happening. Jessica's final word. That night, as Jessica sat in her office, she received an email from an anonymous employee. It was short. "Thank you. Because of what you did, things are finally changing. People are listening now." Jessica stared at the screen for a long moment before leaning back in her chair. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about one bad manager or one bad teller. This was about fixing a broken system. And now, that system had no choice but to change. Jessica Carter hadn't just exposed a problem, she had forced a revolution. What had started as a simple bank withdrawal gone wrong had turned into a national conversation about discrimination, bias, and the silent injustices that many people face when dealing with financial institutions. Jessica didn't just want an apology. She didn't just want one manager fired or one teller retrained. She wanted real change. And now, that's exactly what was happening. The pressure on Summit Trust Bank. In the weeks following the incident at Summit Trust Bank, the corporate office had no choice but to face the firestorm of public scrutiny. Customers weren't just watching, they were demanding change. The company's public apology wasn't enough. People wanted to know, what are you doing to ensure this never happens again? How are you holding employees accountable for biased treatment? What safeguards are in place to make sure every customer is treated fairly? The pressure was relentless. Social media exploded with discussions about racial profiling in banking, economic discrimination, and the need for systemic reforms. Jessica stayed quiet publicly, but privately she was working behind the scenes to make sure Summit Trust Bank didn't just fix its PR problem. She made sure they fixed their system. The company-wide reforms under Jessica's direct guidance, Summit Trust Bank announced sweeping new policies designed to prevent bias, discrimination, and unfair treatment. These weren't just small adjustments. These were major, industry-changing reforms that would impact every single branch in the country. 1. Standardized withdrawal and verification policies. No more case-by-case discretion for verifying withdrawals. Every customer, regardless of appearance or background, would be subject to the same process. Branch managers would no longer have unchecked power to add extra steps at their own discretion. Jessica had seen firsthand how bias hid behind the excuse of security policies. Now, there would be no more gray areas. Rules were rules, applied to everyone equally. 2. Mandatory bias and ethics training for all employees. Every new employee, from tellers to senior managers, would undergo intensive bias training. Existing employees were required to complete quarterly training on racial profiling, discrimination awareness, and fair customer service practices. Employees who failed to meet these standards would be dismissed immediately. Jessica made it clear to corporate, training wasn't going to be a one-time thing. It was going to be constant, monitored, and enforced. 3. Real accountability, customer complaint audits. Every customer complaint related to unfair treatment would now be tracked and investigated. Branches with repeated reports of bias or discrimination would be audited and placed under review. If issues persisted, management would be replaced. Jessica had seen too many companies investigate complaints and do nothing. This time, there were real consequences. Impact beyond Summit Trust Bank. But the changes didn't just stop there. Jessica's battle with Summit Trust Bank had sparked something bigger than she expected. Other major banks began facing similar scrutiny. Customers at other financial institutions started sharing their own experiences of bias. Activists and legal organizations began pressuring other banks to adopt similar policies. Even government officials started discussing new regulations to prevent financial discrimination. Jessica realized something huge. This wasn't just about one bank. This was about fixing an industry-wide problem. The creation of the Fair Banking Initiative. Jessica didn't stop with just fixing Summit Trust Bank. She wanted to ensure that no other customer at any bank would go through what she did. So she launched the Fair Banking Initiative, a national program aimed at checkmark holding banks accountable for fair customer treatment, providing legal resources for individuals facing banking discrimination, pushing for government oversight on racial and economic bias at financial institutions. The response? Massive. Customers, lawyers, and advocacy groups rallied behind the initiative. Lawmakers began discussing policies to enforce fair treatment in banking. Even some banks, seeing the writing on the wall, voluntarily adopted Jessica's proposed reforms. The movement had officially begun, and Jessica Carter, she was leading the charge. The cultural shift in banking. Within a year, the entire banking landscape had changed. Bank employees were trained differently. Customers were more aware of their rights. Financial institutions knew they were being watched and held accountable. Jessica hadn't set out to change an industry. She had only wanted to withdraw her money. But when she saw a broken system, she refused to look away. Now, that system would never be the same again. Jessica's reflection. 1 year later, a year after the incident, Jessica stood in the same Summit Trust Bank branch where it all began. The atmosphere felt different. The employees were more professional. The policies were being followed. And when Jessica walked to the counter to make a withdrawal, no hesitation, no unnecessary questions, no bias, just a simple transaction handled the way it should have been from the start. As she took her cash and turned to leave, She saw a familiar face, a woman standing near the entrance watching Jessica with quiet admiration. She hesitated for a moment, then approached. "Ms. Carter?" she asked softly. "I just wanted to say thank you." Jessica raised an eyebrow. "For what?" The woman smiled. "For making it better." Jessica exhaled slowly, nodding, because in that moment she realized she had won. A powerful lesson on leadership and power. Jessica Carter's journey started with a simple bank withdrawal, but by the end, it had become a defining lesson in leadership, power, and the importance of standing up for what's right. She could have walked away after the first moment of disrespect. She could have accepted the excuses, ignored the bias, and let the system continue unchecked. But true leaders don't stay silent in the face of injustice. Jessica didn't just fight for herself, she fought for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly. She used her power not just to demand respect, but to create change. Because power isn't about titles, wealth, or influence. It's about action. It's about knowing when to speak up, when to push back, and when to demand more. And in that moment, standing in the bank she built, Jessica proved one simple truth. Real power doesn't come from the system. It comes from those brave enough to challenge it. And that's what changes the world.